Welcome to this video lecture about the origins of the Cold War. The Cold War is a term which is mostly associated with the period of geopolitical tension between the USSR and the USA and their respective allies, starting after the Second World War and ending with the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. However, the term can be used in a more general manner. A Cold War is a state of political hostility between countries that does not involve direct military conflict, but is pursued by means of diplomacy, economic competition, propaganda, espionage, and proxy wars. From this point of view, for instance, the conflict in the Middle East between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is in progress right now, is also called a Cold War. However, in this unit, we are going to speak about the US v the USSR Cold War. When discussing the origins of the Cold War, we are going to focus on the breakdown of the World War II Grand Alliance, in which the USA and the USSR cooperated in order to defeat the Axis powers. Their cooperation started to break down and develop into the Cold War. Each of the two superpowers blamed the other side for the breakdown of the relationship and claimed to have reacted to hostile actions of the other superpower. In this video lecture, we are going to focus on how the emergence of the Cold War was viewed and experienced by the USA. Let's start by analyzing a very important speech by former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, delivered in Fulton, USA in March 1946. This so-called Sinews of Peace speech, or Iron Curtain speech, described the geopolitical situation and suggested a course of action the West was supposed to take towards the Soviet expansion. You have 5 questions here, which you're supposed to answer based on what Winston Churchill is saying in this speech. So you can pause the video, read the speech, and prepare your answers to these 5 questions. Fine. Now that you have done that, let's take a look at the answers. What the answers are supposed to be. Question number 1. Which countries, according to Churchill, belong to the Soviet sphere of influence? So behind that line, which descended across the continent, lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Poland; Berlin, Germany; Prague, Czechoslovakia; Vienna, Austria; Budapest, Hungary; Belgrade, Serbia, or at that time, I guess, Yugoslavia; Bucharest, Romania; and Sofia, Bulgaria. So these are the countries which, according to Churchill, belong to the Soviet sphere of influence. Number 2. How does the USSR use her influence in these countries? So what Churchill speaks about is that communist parties, which were small in these countries, have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers, right? So a small, not that important and powerful and popular political party, because of the Soviet influence, is rising to power and preeminence, and is going to obtain totalitarian control. Churchill also describes that these countries are turning into police states with police governments, and that there is no true democracy. Number 3. In what way is Czechoslovakia different from the other Eastern European countries? So he makes Czechoslovakia an exception when he speaks about no true democracy, because in March 1946, Czechoslovakia was still a democratic country. It was almost 2 years before the communists were to take power at the end of February 1948. So at this point, Czechoslovakia was still obviously a democratic country. How, according to Churchill, question number 4, should Western democracies act in order to keep Soviet expansion in check? So what he says is that there is nothing for which the Soviets have less respect than for military weakness, and they admire strengths. So if the Western democracies stand together in strict adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter, their influence for furthering these principles will be immense and no one is likely to molest them. So what Churchill is basically saying that the only thing which the Soviets, the Russians respect is strength. So the countries of the West are supposed to stand united and basically oppose the Soviet expansion with force and strength. And the last question, in your own words, summarize what you think is Churchill's attitude towards the Soviets. I mean, you can use like different words and phrases. What I would say probably is that Churchill considers the USSR to be an aggressive and expansionist power, which is a threat to the international peace, and which can only be stopped by the combined effort and firm stance of the Western world. So let us now take a look at the emergence of the Cold War from the point of view of the Americans. This is the American president in this time, Harry Truman. And when in 1946 Truman looked at the situation in Europe and in Asia, he had a huge fear of Stalin's or Soviet expansionism. And there were several reasons which justified this feeling of nervousness and fear when it comes to the Soviets. Firstly, the communist ideology aims at the world revolution in which proletarians overthrow the capitalist system. So it was inherent to the Soviets and their ideology that they wanted to expand, that they wanted to export their ideology to other countries and basically organize a revolution in as many countries as possible. So inherently, the Soviet Union was an expansionist country. Secondly, despite having signed the Atlantic Charter, Stalin expanded the USSR after the war by annexing the Baltic states, eastern Poland, Ruthenia, Bessarabia, and parts of Finland. These were territories which the USSR gained by allying with Nazi Germany, and the USSR or Stalin browbeat the Allies to allow the Soviets to keep these territories. So, despite having pledged not to fight the war for territorial expansion, the Soviets actually expanded quite considerably thanks to their victory in the war. Moreover, despite Stalin's promises of free elections in the liberated countries, all over Eastern Europe, communist regimes were springing up and dismantling democracy. There was this document which the Grand Alliance members signed. It was called the Declaration of Liberated Europe. And in this document, they pledged that they would allow, in all those countries which they would liberate, they would allow free elections to take place and the people in these countries to decide about what sort of government they wanted to have. But in those countries which were liberated by the USSR, by the Red Army, it was obviously not the case. And slowly but surely, the Eastern Bloc was created on the western frontier of the USSR. Here you can see the map of the Eastern Bloc countries together with the years in which these countries turned to communism. Apart from the pressure and expansion in Eastern Europe, Stalin was also putting pressure on other countries. Number one, Iran. The USSR was trying to persuade the Iranian government to grant the Soviets some advantageous oil concessions, like trade deals involving oil. And like the pressure which they were putting was was pretty much diplomatic, but also to a certain extent military. Another country which was rather problematic, or which was facing pressure from the USSR, was Turkey. Uh, the problem of Russia for centuries had been, and the Soviets basically faced the same problem too, had been the fact that they didn't really have a lot of ice-free ports. And those ice-free ports, which means that a port which doesn't freeze over the winter, uh, those ice-free ports which they had were located in the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is problematic because if you have your fleet in the Black Sea and you want to get it out there to the Atlantic, you need to pass through the two Black Sea Straits, Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. And these were, of course, under control of Turkey. And in this period, Turkey is facing an intense pressure from the Soviets to hand over the control of the Black Sea Straits to the USSR, so as to secure the passage of the Black Sea fleet into the Mediterranean and then, of course, out into the Atlantic Ocean. And lastly, another country in which the Soviets, or in which it seemed that the communists were expanding, was Greece, in which a civil war was going on. The communist guerrillas were trying to overthrow the government and turn Greece into communism. So when Truman takes a look at the map at this period, he is really concerned because Stalin is obviously breaking promises and violating agreements in his effort to expand to expand communism to other countries, to export communism, and to expand Soviet influence. This is not just Truman's feeling, but he is actually getting warnings from other people who have some insight into the geopolitical situation. One of the most important warnings which Truman gets is the so-called long telegram. It was written by Moscow-based US diplomat George Kennan. This is him in the picture. And it was written in February 1946. It's called a long telegram because in telegrams you basically pay for every character which you write, so you usually try to keep it brief. But this telegram was actually 8,000 words long, and it explains in great detail the geopolitical or the political situation in the USSR. And what Kennan was basically saying in this telegram is that Stalin considers his former allies enemies, and it is impossible to negotiate with him because Stalin basically feels that the USSR is surrounded by countries which are hostile to the Soviets and to communism. So there are enemies everywhere. And Stalin's expansion could only be stopped by a resolute US resistance and containment of communism. And this telegram was really impactful. It had a lot of impact and a lot of influence on Truman's decision making. Another important warning comes from Churchill. You have already read from the speech which he delivered in a U.S. city called Fulton in Missouri, while receiving an honorary doctorate here. And this is a month later after the long telegram in March 1946. And what Churchill is saying here, and Truman is actually like sitting in the audience while Churchill is delivering the speech. What he says is that Europe is divided by an iron curtain. And he uses this phrase, iron curtain, which will become like synonymous with the division of Europe into the two blocks, democratic and totalitarian. So Europe is divided by an Iron Curtain as the USSR is spreading its influence over Eastern Europe. And the USSR is taking over states in her sphere of influence, and the democratic world must stop her from doing that. So, because of all these signs of, oh yeah, here's a picture of the Iron Curtain. So, because of all these signs of Soviet expansion and also all these warnings which are coming to Truman, he decides to take action. And what this basically results in is a tremendous shift in American foreign policy. So in March 1947, the Truman Doctrine is announced. Truman addresses the Congress asking for financial aid to Greece and Turkey. These states were under Soviet pressure, and Britain had neither power nor finances to come to their aid, so they basically asked the Americans to take over. And Truman basically asks the Congress for financial aid to be provided to Greece and Turkey so that they could face the Soviet pressure with greater chances of success. And when he is making this speech, what Truman is speaking about is something which will become the foreign policy doctrine of the USA basically throughout the whole Cold War, and it's called containment. The Soviets are expanding, but the Americans have to stop it. The USA must come to aid of any country which gets under communist pressure, and the USSR must be contained within its present border. What Truman is basically saying is that, okay, the communists have already taken over in some countries. The communists have a lot of influence all over the world. We can't basically do anything about it unless we want to fight a war against them. But what we must do is to prevent them from expanding any further. So we have to contain them within their present borders. The policy of containment. This is a major shift in US foreign policy because before World War II, and I mean for a long time before World War II, the US was an isolationist country. The idea was that the Americans only cared about what was going on in the Americas and didn't really care about what was happening anywhere else. They wanted to stay out of any other conflict in other parts of the world. And now, what Truman is saying here is that the US pledges to be engaged all across the globe. So from isolationism, we only care about this rather limited sphere of influence, to engagement all across the globe. Because what Truman is saying is that any country which gets under communist pressure will be helped, will be aided by the USA, anywhere in the world, whatever country it is. So from a rather limited sphere of influence to saying that the whole bloody world is basically the US sphere of influence. And historians are quite in agreement that the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment is based on the long telegram by George Kennan. So here you can see the USSR expanding all over the world, and the Americans having the duty to stop it and to contain the USSR and communism in its present borders. One practical result of Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment was the so-called Marshall Plan in 1947 and later. It was called after US Secretary of State George Marshall, who was a famous World War II general. and it was a plan for European economic recovery. The idea was that $13 billion from the US budget, like paid by the US taxpayers, was supposed to be pumped to specific spheres of industry to jumpstart the economy in all these European countries which were damaged by the war. I mean, it sounds pretty awesome and very altruistic, the Americans giving money away to help other countries. But, and of course, to a certain extent, it was pretty altruistic, but there were ideological and economic reasons behind this. The economic reason is that in order to prosper, the USA needed European countries as trade partners. The USA was producing a lot of goods, a lot of stuff, and the Europeans were normally the partners, trading partners who would buy all these things. So, but now, after the war, their economies were destroyed, so the USA lost these trading partners, and without trading partners, the US economy couldn't thrive. So, by providing this aid and getting the European economy back, or European economies back on their feet, it was actually making sure that the US has enough trading partners in the future and can grow economically. The ideological reason behind the Marshall Plan was the idea, already expressed by Churchill and Kennan, that communism is successful in conditions of poverty. Poor people like the idea of communism, right? Because it's about other, more like richer, wealthier people sharing their wealth with the less fortunate, with the poor people. So if you're poor, you like it, right? But you don't really like it if you're well-to-do, if you're rich. So the idea is that European economies have to get back on their feet so that people in those countries are well-to-do. People in those countries like have higher living standards, and then these people will not like the ideas of communism. Communism will not appeal to them, and they will not vote for the Communist Party in their elections. So the Marshall Plan, throwing money at Europe in order to jumpstart the European economy, because the Americans needed the European countries as their trading partners, and also because it would save these European countries from succumbing to communism. The result of the Marshall Plan was an unexpectedly fast economic recovery and growth of those European states which received the aid, which of course led to increased living standards and increased prestige and influence of the USSR in these countries. So the plan was to stop the spread of communism more to the west, and to a great extent this was achieved. But at this point already we can say that the relationships between the West and the East, between the USA and the USSR, have broken down, and by 1948-49 the Cold War is on. Thank you for your attention.